Before America was ever a country, power already existed, but it did not sit in a capital or obey a single authority. That power lived locally, inside land decisions, small rules, and everyday enforcement that kept communities alive. And once power grows close to the ground like this, pulling it back later becomes extremely difficult without breaking the system. In this episode, we start with land and trace, how controlling land quietly turns into controlling rules and outcomes. In the earliest colonies, survival mattered more than ideology, so land had to be organized before anything else could function. Land determined where people could settle, what they could grow, and how long they could realistically stay. Because land was scarce and valuable, someone always had to decide who received it and under what conditions. That decision alone created authority, even before formal governments or written constitutions existed. Once land is assigned, boundaries must be marked, recorded, and defended to prevent constant disputes. Records, maps, and ledgers quietly become tools of power, because they decide what counts as legitimate ownership. When ownership is questioned, disputes follow naturally, forcing communities to define local rules for resolution. These rules do not start as ideology, but as practical shortcuts to keep daily life from falling apart. As rules repeat, people begin expecting similar outcomes, which slowly turns habits into informal law. Once expectations form, someone must interpret those rules, or conflicts return even stronger than before. This is where local courts emerge, not as moral ideals, but as tools to stabilize everyday interactions. Courts require enforcement, because decisions without force quickly lose meaning in tense environments. Enforcement usually comes from local constables or militias, backed by community recognition and necessity. At this point, authority feels normal and practical, which is why it spreads without resistance. People comply not because they love power, but because the system produces outcomes they can live with. Over time, these local solutions harden into expectations about who should decide and who should obey. Once land and rules are established, communities need resources to maintain courts, records, and enforcement. That is when small fees, fines, and local charges quietly enter the system, framed as maintenance rather than taxation. Money changes the system, because collecting it requires tracking, authority, and consistent procedures. Once payment becomes routine, the question shifts from whether to comply to who has the right to collect. This is where power begins to harden, because revenue turns authority into something permanent and predictable. With money, local institutions can plan, expand, and enforce decisions more consistently than before. Consistency builds trust, and trust quietly shifts legitimacy toward whoever keeps the system running. At this stage, authority is no longer abstract, because people interact with it through payments and procedures. Local officials become familiar figures, not symbols, which makes their power feel ordinary and acceptable. Meanwhile, distant authority remains slow, indirect, and largely absent from everyday financial decisions. This creates a quiet imbalance between formal sovereignty and practical control, without open conflict or rebellion. People begin solving problems locally, because that is where decisions are made and enforced without delay. Over time, this habit reduces dependence on distant rulers. Even though formal loyalty still exists on paper, authority does not disappear from the center, but it becomes less relevant to everyday survival on the ground. This gap grows quietly, because systems rarely announce power shifts while they are happening. By the mid-18th century, many colonies managed land, law, and money with minimal outside input. Local efficiency creates confidence, which slowly turns practical authority into assumed legitimacy. Legitimacy here does not come from declarations, but from procedures that keep producing workable outcomes. And once legitimacy shifts locally, reversing it requires more than commands or distant laws. That reversal attempt begins the moment outside authority demands more money than local systems expect to give. When outside authority starts paying attention, it usually does so because local systems now produce real revenue. Money signals capacity, and capacity attracts control, especially from a center that feels financially stretched. Requests begin softly, framed as coordination or contribution rather than direct command or takeover. Local institutions often comply at first, because the amounts seem manageable and the logic feels reasonable. But each contribution quietly changes expectations about who ultimately controls local revenue streams. Over time, requests stop feeling occasional and start feeling structural, embedded into routine operations. This is where friction emerges, because local systems were built to fund themselves, not distant priorities. Friction does not mean refusal yet, but it changes how people interpret authority and obligation. Local leaders begin asking quiet questions about limits, rights, and justification behind new demands. These questions are not ideological yet, they are practical concerns about sustainability and control. When answers arrive slowly, or vaguely, uncertainty spreads through systems that depend on predictability. Uncertainty weakens trust, because systems function best when expectations remain stable and clear. As trust erodes, local compliance becomes conditional rather than automatic, even without open resistance. Conditional compliance is dangerous, because it signals a shift in how legitimacy is calculated. Authority now must justify itself, rather than being assumed through habit and routine. Justification requires explanation. Explanation invites debate, and debate slows decision. Slower decisions expose structural tensions that were previously hidden by efficiency and distance. At this point, the conflict is no longer about money alone, but about control and recognition. Local systems feel capable, while distant authority feels intrusive rather than supportive. This tension sets the stage for a deeper break, once enforcement replaces negotiation. When negotiation fails to resolve uncertainty, outside authority turns to enforcement to restore control. Enforcement feels efficient from the center, but it disrupts systems that already function locally. When enforcement arrives late, it clashes with routines people rely on for stability and predictability. This clash reframes authority, transforming it from problem solver into external pressure. Once authority is seen as pressure, compliance shifts from habit into strategic calculation. Local leaders begin coordinating responses, not to rebel, but to protect existing systems. Coordination spreads horizontally, connecting colonies that previously operated independently. Horizontal communication reduces isolation and reveals shared structural problems across regions. Shared problems invite shared language, slowly turning practical concerns into collective arguments. These arguments emerge not from ideology, but from repeated experiences of disruption and constraint. At this stage, resistance remains procedural, focused on petitions, delays, and negotiation tactics. Procedural resistance slows enforcement, increasing costs and reducing the center's ability to act decisively. As costs rise, enforcement feels less corrective and more coercive to those experiencing it. This perception accelerates legitimacy loss, because authority appears disconnected from local needs. Local cooperation deepens, turning isolated disputes into a shared defense of autonomy. Autonomy becomes a practical demand, not a philosophical statement about freedom. At this point, power is no longer simply local or distant. It is contested in between. Contested authority creates instability, because no single actor can resolve disputes alone. As instability grows, pressure builds for a structural solution rather than continued negotiation. That pressure leads to a critical realization: loose coordination is no longer enough to survive. When loose coordination fails, local systems realize survival now requires more durable structures. This realization does not create unity overnight, but it changes how problems are framed. Instead of asking how to resist demands, colonies ask how to coordinate authority without losing control. This shift marks a turning point, because coordination itself becomes a political problem. Local power has grown strong enough to matter, but not strong enough to act alone under pressure. This creates a dilemma: remain separate and risk collapse, or merge and risk losing local control. The dilemma is not ideological, it is structural, rooted in how authority was built from the ground up. At this stage, no one is designing a nation, but everyone feels the limits of the existing system. Those limits become visible as enforcement costs rise faster than compliance can be maintained. When costs escalate, authority must adapt structurally, or rely increasingly on force. Relying on force accelerates legitimacy loss, because it confirms fears of external domination. This feedback loop tightens, making compromise harder while coordination becomes more urgent. Pressure builds for a system that can collect resources, coordinate decisions, and still limit concentrated power. That system does not exist yet, but the need for it is now undeniable. What began as local survival mechanisms has grown into a structural crisis of coordination. This crisis is not independence yet. It is about how authority can function without tearing itself apart. Power is now stuck between local strength and collective weakness, and the middle space becomes unstable. Staying in that middle space cannot last, because pressure keeps rising without any reliable release valve. The next conflict will force a choice, not about loyalty, but about structure. That choice will center on money, representation, and who has the right to decide for others. Until that question is answered, every demand for revenue will feel illegitimate and dangerous. This is the breaking point of the first system, built to survive locally, but not to govern collectively. The system has not failed completely, but it has reached a limit it cannot cross alone. In the next episode, that limit is tested through taxes, representation, and the demand to pay without a voice.